He didn't know her name, just saw a woman in a weathered military jacket sitting in silence outside a roadside diner, her arms wrapped around two exhausted little girls in the cold. No signs, no tears, just quiet dignity and nothing left. Then he said it. "You're coming with me." What happened next was not rescue, it was transformation. A single act of kindness unraveled buried scars, revealed a truth no one saw coming, and sparked a bond that would rebuild everything they thought they'd lost. Are you watching this late at night or on a quiet morning? And wherever you are in the world, if redemption stories speak to something deep in you, tap that subscribe button and stay. Because this one doesn't just move you, it stays with you. The biting winds howled down from the Appalachian foothills like a wild beast, tearing at David Coleman's heavy flannel shirt as he stepped out of the roadside diner. Snowflakes, not quite snow yet, but the kind of vindictive icy drizzle rural Georgia spit at you in early March stung his dark cheeks. He tightened his grip on the paper bag of hot food. It had been a long, demanding day at the local timber yard, and all he yearned for was to get home, warm up dinner for his son Marcus, and perhaps catch a few innings of a late-night basketball game. But something, a fleeting flicker of motion in the periphery of his vision, stopped him. There, nestled under the meager eaves of the diner, where the dim yellow light struggled to reach, sat a woman. She was clad in a worn, faded army jacket, her shoulders hunched against the relentless cold. Her arms were wrapped tightly around two little girls no older than 5 or 6. Identical crimson hats covered their small heads, and their tiny feet, bare, except for mismatched socks, swung just above the slush-covered ground. The three of them were silent, remarkably still, as if even a breath might draw unwanted attention. David's heavy boots crunched on the icy pavement as he shifted his weight. He recognized that look, the guarded stillness, the profound exhaustion buried beneath a shield of pride. It was the same look he'd caught in his own reflection after Lena, his beloved wife, had passed. It was the same look he'd seen in the eyes of countless folks when he used to volunteer at the community shelter in the city before he moved back to his family land here. He hadn't intended to approach, truly he hadn't, but his feet seemed to have a will of their own. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice a low, steady rumble, careful not to startle her. "You folks all right?" The woman looked up. Her eyes met his, a sharp, intelligent gaze, yet weary in a way that spoke of too many battles fought far from any battlefield. Her jaw tightened. She offered no reply. David hesitated, then slowly crouched down a few feet away, maintaining a low, unthreatening posture. He wore no badge. He wasn't a social worker or a preacher. He was just a man in a plaid shirt, a black man who understood what it looked like when someone had run completely out of options. "My name's David," he offered. "I've got a house a few miles out. Got a little boy, 7 years old. Made too much food tonight." He held out the bag gently, as if offering peace a truce. "There's fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Maybe some warmth if you wanted." The woman stared at him, then down at her daughters, then back at him. Her lips parted, but no sound escaped. Then David said it, 4 words spoken without conscious thought, from a place deeper than mere charity. "You're coming with me." Silence settled like the falling snow around them. One of the girls looked up at her mother and whispered something too soft to hear. The woman nodded almost imperceptibly. David stood and stepped back, giving her space. She rose slowly, balancing one child in each arm. Her movements were stiff, cautious, not from distrust, but from a fatigue that seemed to penetrate to her very bones. As they neared his truck, David opened the passenger door, laid his heavy coat over the front seat, and watched as she carefully helped the girls inside. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. They simply held hands, looking straight ahead as if bracing for the next test of survival. He started the engine and turned the heater on full blast. The woman didn't look at him as he drove, but when they passed the last streetlight on the edge of town, she finally spoke. "My name's Simone," she said, her voice raspy. He nodded. "Nice to meet you, Simone." There was a pause. "Then," she said, voice steadier now, "Staff Sergeant Simone Dubois, deployed twice during the Iran-Israel escalation, U.S. Army Logistics Division." David glanced at her. She wasn't boasting. It was simply a statement of fact, a title that no longer came with a paycheck, a salute, or even a home. "I figured," he said quietly. "You still carry yourself like someone who's been in command." Her mouth quirked slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. The girls had already fallen asleep against her shoulders, entrusting this stranger with the kind of faith only children could still afford. David's house came into view, a modest, comfortable home nestled against the forest line. Smoke curled from the chimney like a warm welcome sign. He parked in the driveway and turned to her. "Come on in. We'll get you all cleaned up and fed. You can figure out your next step in the morning." Simone didn't move for a long moment. Then finally, she nodded. Inside, Marcus, his 7-year-old son, blinked at the unexpected visitors, but his father's calm demeanor told him everything was okay. David introduced them, and before long the children were sitting cross-legged on the rug sharing chicken tenders and juice boxes like old friends. Marcus handed them action figures and even offered to let them sleep in his room. Simone stood at the doorway, still in her boots, unsure whether she was trespassing or dreaming. "You're safe here," David said gently. "No questions tonight, just warmth and rest." She looked at him, then not with gratitude, not yet, but with a flicker of something he hadn't seen in her eyes, before a tiny spark of belief. That maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the road. Maybe it was the first real stop. Outside, the storm finally broke loose rain, drumming hard against the roof. But inside that little home in Georgia, for the first time in a long time, 3 strangers weren't running anymore. They had been invited in, and they stayed. David stood in the hallway, a clean towel in hand, staring at the closed door to the guest room. He had folded it 3 times, then once more, like that would make it softer somehow. The bed inside was made with care, fresh linens, 3 blankets neatly stacked at the foot, the small space heater humming steadily in the corner. The room wasn't much just a converted office with a creaky dresser, a nightstand with a missing drawer, and a faded painting of the Blue Ridge Mountains hung slightly crooked above the bed. But it was warm, safe, and more than he'd had to offer anyone in a long time. Then came the soft creak of floorboards. He turned and found her there. Simone stood in the half-light, her shoulders hunched slightly forward, one daughter asleep in her arms, the other clinging tight to her jacket hem, eyes wide with the wary silence of children who've seen too much. Her boots were still caked in slush. Her damp hair clung to her cheeks. The color in her face wasn't from the cold. It was exhaustion that looked like it had been stitched into her skin. David didn't ask if she needed help. He simply stepped aside and opened the door, keeping his voice low. "This way." She hesitated for a breath, just one, but then stepped in. She moved like someone used to calculating exits, eyes sweeping the space before lowering the girl onto the bed. With practiced gentleness, she coaxed the other under the covers. There were no bedtime songs, no whispered stories, just a kiss to each forehead and a quiet, steady, "I'm right here." The kind of assurance that wasn't poetic, but necessary. David watched. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, almost tactical, but beneath that armor, there was something unmistakably tender. She sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, still in her boots, staring at the far wall, like she expected it to disappear. "You should rest too," David said softly. "You look like you haven't in days." She gave a tired glance. "I haven't." He nodded. He didn't pry, didn't press. There were wounds that didn't like to be named out loud, so instead he offered the only olive branch he had. "There's tea if you want." Another pause. Then slowly she stood, stepped back into the hallway, and pulled the door almost shut behind her, leaving just a sliver of space, maybe for air, maybe for hope. In the kitchen, the kettle began to whistle, soft but insistent. David moved with the quiet care of someone used to long silences. He poured 2 mugs and slid one across the table as she sat opposite him. It was the first time they'd really faced each other in the calm after survival. Now, under real light, she looked older than her years, but not worn out. More like weathered. Her eyes were alert, even now, always scanning, always ready. But tired. Not the tired of missed sleep. The tired of caring too much for too long, with no one to hand it to. "They're beautiful girls," David said gently. She nodded. "Maya and Chloe. Just turned 6. He smiled. "Twins. I thought so. They've got the same look when they size someone up." Chloe follows Maya's lead. She said, a flicker of something like amusement behind her exhaustion. "Maya thinks that makes her the boss." David chuckled. "She's not wrong. And your son, Marcus, 7 going on 70, talks to trees, reads cookbooks like they're sacred texts." She blinked, then gave the faintest laugh. "That's rare." "He is. We've been figuring it out. His mom, Lena, passed 3 years ago. Accident on the highway." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Simone didn't tilt her head or whisper condolences. She just nodded, a nod that said, "I know loss too." Silence settled between them like a worn blanket. The old clock on the wall ticked and the heater hummed from down the hall. David watched her fingers wrap tightly around the mug. She held it like it might vanish if she loosened her grip, like it was the first warmth she trusted not to burn her. "You're not the first person I've helped," he said eventually, "but you might be the first who didn't ask for it. I didn't come looking for charity." "I know," he said. There was a long pause before she added quietly, "The girls were hungry. We saw the light. I didn't think anyone would notice us." He looked straight at her. "I didn't notice you. I saw you." That landed. She inhaled sharply, not alarmed, not offended, just seen. Her grip on the mug eased. Her shoulders dropped slightly. "You don't know anything about me," she said, not challenging, just factual. "No," he replied, "but I know enough." Another silence. But this one was warmer, easier, like a door gently nudging open. "I don't know how long we'll stay," she said after a beat. "A few days, just until I figure out the next step." "There's no clock on kindness," David said. "Stay as long as you need." This time her whole posture shifted. Not much, but enough to notice. A fraction of a surrender. A toe off the cliff of guardedness. "They haven't slept in a warm bed in weeks," she murmured. "Then tonight's a good night," he said. They sat like that for a while, saying little, letting quiet do what words sometimes couldn't. Outside, wind pressed against the windows like a reminder that the world could still be cruel. But inside, something small and honest had taken root. Before she left the table, Simone paused. Her voice was low even. "I served 12 years, 4 tours overseas, logistics and convoy operations, Iran-Israel conflict. I lost good people. Then I came home and tried to rebuild." David didn't interrupt. "My husband, Thomas, he couldn't handle who I was anymore. Said I brought the war home." David let the words settle. "You're still rebuilding," he said finally. "Bricks take time." She nodded almost involuntarily. And for the first time, behind all the weariness and steel, he saw it, not hope, not yet, but room for it. When she disappeared down the hall, he stayed at the table, hands curled around the cooling mug. The house had been still for so long, too still. But now, it wasn't quiet in the same way. It was waiting. It was holding its breath for something new. It had begun, he realized, with 4 words and a door that stayed open. Morning broke quietly over the Georgia horizon, laying a soft silver light across the pine trees that rimmed David's property. The snow from the night before sat like sifted sugar on the roof, barely an inch, just enough to hush the world. In the kitchen, David stood at the sink, his hands resting on the edge as he watched the sky shift from cold gray to a tentative, forgiving blue. Behind him, the coffee percolated, filling the room with the scent of warmth and routine. He didn't hear her enter. When he turned, Simone was there, silent, barefoot, on the tile, arms wrapped loosely around herself. She wore an oversized flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up the hem, falling just past her knees. His flannel. She must have found it in the laundry basket. Her hair was damp at the ends, braided loosely over one shoulder, and her skin held the soft flush of someone who'd just stepped out of a hot shower into cold air. In the morning light, she looked like someone the world had tried to break, but hadn't. Not completely. Not yet. "Morning," she said, voice still gravel-edged with sleep. David offered a small smile and poured her a cup. "Hope flannel suits you." "It's warm," she replied, taking the mug and wrapping her hands around it like a lifeline. "That's all that matters these days." They stood there a moment side by side, saying nothing. From the living room came the faint rustling of blanket forts being fortified, and then a burst of laughter, childlike, wild, and completely unguarded. "I forgot how early kids wake up," Simone murmured, sipping her coffee. "They've been up since 6, David said. "I heard them planning something involving crayons and world domination. I didn't have the heart to stop it." She smiled, truly smiled, for the first time that day. "They haven't laughed like that in weeks." David looked over at her. "You either." She didn't answer, but the silence wasn't a rejection. It was a pause to absorb something, maybe the truth in his words, maybe the way they didn't sting. He didn't press. He'd learned that after Lena died, some wounds needed quiet more than questions. Some trust had to grow in the space where words weren't needed. After breakfast, he invited her out to the porch. The sun had risen just enough to warm the wooden boards underfoot, and the air was clean, smelled like pine old wood, and the ghost of smoke from last night's fire. He handed her a second mug of coffee and gestured toward the swing at the edge of the porch. She hesitated, not out of reluctance, but calculation, measuring how safe it was to settle into something still and kind. Then she sat, He joined her close enough to share space, not enough to crowd it. The silence stretched again, easier this time. Comfortable. "You ever serve?" she asked, eventually, voice soft. David nodded. "Not in uniform. I was a paramedic for 18 years. City work. Saw my share of chaos. Not quite IEDs and desert air, but I know what it's like to run into something when everyone else is running out." She nodded, eyes on the tree line. "I thought coming home would be the easy part." He didn't interrupt. She needed to say it. "Thomas and I had a plan. He was infantry, 3rd tour when we married. After he opened a shop, custom bikes. I got promoted. We had the girls. It felt like we made it." She paused. Her jaw tightened slightly. "Turns out the war doesn't stay overseas. It finds ways to unpack itself in the kitchen, in the silence, after an argument." He started drinking, getting mean. Said I came home more soldier than wife. Like love had a weight limit. David looked straight ahead, jaw set. "That's a hell of a thing to come back to." She gave a hollow laugh. "I could disarm roadside bombs blindfolded, but I couldn't navigate my own living room." He turned to her. "Survival doesn't always look like combat medals. Sometimes it's just getting up, packing lunchboxes, remembering the names of school staff. You survived, Simone." She looked at him, slowly, fully. "So did you." He nodded. "Lena was my compass. When I lost her, I drifted. Marcus anchored me without even trying. Kids don't know it, but their lifeline's sometimes more for us than the other way around." She took a slow breath, deeper than before. "Not just air, space. I don't talk about Thomas. Or the war," she said. "I won't ask again." But she shook her head. "No, I want to. I just don't always remember how." "You don't have to tell it all," David said gently. "But if you ever want to sit here and just say nothing, I'll sit with you." She smiled then. A quiet, steady kind. The kind that wasn't for show. Later that afternoon, the backyard was full of shouting and laughter. Marcus climbed a low branch with Simone steadying his foot. David pushed Chloe on the swing, while Maya buried pine cones under a pile of snow and declared herself Queen of the North. It wasn't a perfect family, wasn't even a clear one, but it was something. And something, David had learned, was everything. That night, as David locked the front door and turned off the porch light, he passed the hallway where Simone's room sat. The door was cracked open slightly, just enough for a sliver of warm light to spill across the floorboards. Something about that soft glow stopped him. A quiet invitation, or maybe a reminder. He realized something in that moment, something simple and startling in its clarity. He didn't know how long she'd stay. She hadn't promised permanence, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of her leaving. Because amid the silence and the sleepless nights, amid pillow forts and whispered fears, they were beginning to build something. Not out of need, not out of romance or rescue, but out of recognition. Two people who had once lived in command, now learning to live in kindness. The smell of sizzling butter and flour drifted through the house before the sun even touched the treetops. It pulled David from sleep like a thread. He rubbed his eyes, yawned into the hallway, and followed the scent barefoot, the floor cool beneath his feet. He paused at the kitchen doorway. Simone was at the stove, flipping pancakes with a fluid ease that surprised him. 2 days ago, she looked like she hadn't cooked in months. Now, in an oversized hoodie, Marcus's State University sweatshirt, and borrowed flannel pajama pants cinched at the waist with a safety pin, she looked almost settled. Her braid was loose, the end brushing her collarbone. There was flour dusting her cheek and a slight crease between her brows as she focused on the pan. In that quiet domesticity, she didn't look like a soldier or even a survivor. She looked like a mother, just a mother trying to start a day. "Morning," she said, without turning her voice low and hoarse from sleep. David leaned against the doorframe. "Hope you don't mind me saying this, but you're dangerously close to making breakfast a habit." She smirked, glancing back. "Kids were up. Seemed like the least I could do." "I've never minded waking up to pancakes," he replied. "Is this a tactical strategy?" "Phase 1, she said, flicking her wrist. "Phase 2 involves bacon and psychological dominance." He chuckled. "Should I wave the white flag now or after the syrup?" At the table, Marcus sat between the twins, eyes wide, grinning, like he'd won the lottery. Crayons and napkins lay scattered in front of them. Half drawings of dinosaurs and castles covered the table like battle plans. The girls whispered and giggled between bites. David set the plates while Simone worked quietly, gracefully. As they all sat to eat, David found himself watching her, not out of suspicion, but out of something more grounded respect, quiet awe. She hadn't said much yesterday, But today she laughed when Marcus made a dinosaur noise too loud. She gently untangled Chloe's braid mid-bite and wiped syrup from Maya's chin with a practiced hand. Her presence filled the room in a way that didn't demand space, but made it warmer. He hadn't heard this kind of noise in years. Not since Lena. Not since the stillness of grief settled in and made itself at home. After breakfast, the kids ran off to rebuild the pillow fort, now fortified with new rules and a flag drawn in crayon. Simone began to clear the dishes. "You cooked," David said. "That means you don't clean." She handed him the sponge anyway. "I don't like owing people." He paused, looked at her, and said gently, "You're not a debt." That stopped her, not fully, but enough to shift the air. She leaned against the counter, watching the snow outside dusting the pine branches, falling slower, now gentler. David dried a plate. "I used to dream about mornings like this," he said. Coffee clinking dishes, kids arguing about who drew the better dragon. Simone didn't speak. Her silence wasn't cold, it was full. Listening. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "Really?" She turned then slightly. "I have nightmares," she said, voice flat like she was stating the weather. David didn't move. "Not every night, but often. I wake up and forget where I am. Sometimes I reach for my weapon. Sometimes I call out commands. The girls know to wait. They don't cry anymore. They just watch me until my breathing slows." David set the towel down. She kept going. "Thomas couldn't take it. Said I brought the war home. Said I came back wrong. But it wasn't war that changed me. It was surviving it. You shouldn't have had to carry that alone," David said, voice steady. "I did." She didn't blink. "Still do." "Not here." She looked at him, not for comfort but for confirmation, for evidence that maybe, just maybe, he meant that. "I'm not easy," she said after a beat, defensive rehearsed. "I'm not looking for easy," he replied. "I'm looking for real." Her eyes softened, barely, but enough. "I'm not sure I know how to be real anymore." "Then we'll figure it out," David said. "Together. Or not. There's no test, no timeline, just time. And kindness when we can manage it." She let out a breath that sounded like something being released. "You talk like someone who's lived through the fire." "I have." The sunlight climbed steadily through the window, turning the cold kitchen golden. They didn't move for a while. Just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, two people not healed, but not hiding either. Then came a scream from the living room, a high-pitched, overly dramatic yell of betrayal. They rushed in, hearts skipping. Chloe stood amid a scattered pile of pillows, furious. "He broke the tower," she declared. David gave Marcus a look. He shrugged, sheepish. "It was an accident." Simone stepped forward, scooping Chloe into her arms. "You're safe," she whispered, brushing her hair back. "It's just a game. You're safe." David watched her, her hands steady, her voice calm, and understood then that Simone wasn't broken. She wasn't lost. She was rebuilding, one brick at a time. Later that afternoon, folding laundry, David found something tucked deep in the hoodie pocket, a small weathered insignia, her army captain's bars. The metal dulled, scratched, but still intact. He turned it over in his hand, then walked to the mantel above the fireplace. Without ceremony, he set it there between a photo of Lena and a pine cone Marcus once insisted was magic. When Simone passed through the room and saw it, she paused. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes said enough. That evening, after the kids were asleep and the house had settled into its quiet hum, Simone passed by the fireplace on her way to the kitchen. She slowed as she noticed something, her army captain's bars still resting on the mantel where David had placed them. Not displayed with fanfare, just quietly there between family photos and a half-burned candle. She stood there a moment, then spoke without looking over. "You didn't ask," she said. David, leaning in the hallway's soft glow, replied gently, "Didn't have to. That pin says enough." She turned toward him, not quite smiling, but her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "You're not like other men I've met." He lifted an eyebrow, dry. "That's probably a good thing." This time she didn't smirk. She simply nodded like she was logging something important. "A truth, maybe. Thank you for letting us stay." David held her gaze. "Stay as long as you need. This house is better with you in it." They didn't say anything more, but something shifted in that space between them. Something real. The soldier in her hadn't vanished, but now she wasn't only that. She was becoming Simone again. The next day, afternoon light poured through the living room windows in golden slats, casting stripes across the floor like warm prison bars. But this room was no longer a cage. Crayons, coloring books, and bits of cut paper were scattered everywhere, a soft mess of joy. Simone sat cross-legged on the floor, her back resting against the couch, one elbow propped on a pillow, fingers absently rubbing a wrinkle in her jeans. She watched the children with a calm she hadn't known in years, half present, half drifting. Her mind wandered in slow waves, not to war, not to her past life, but to the strange quiet of now. Chloe and Maya were curled up together, whispering and giggling like little conspirators. Marcus sat nearby, pretending to read about dinosaurs, but his eyes kept sliding over to Maya's intense coloring, fascinated by the way her tongue poked out as she focused. From the kitchen, the sound of plates clinking. Then David appeared, carrying a tray of grilled cheese sandwiches. His sleeves were rolled up, and his hair stuck out in all directions from splitting firewood. A dusting of ash clung to one elbow. He looked tired in the way that felt satisfying, like a man who'd spent energy doing something real. "Okay," he announced, "lunch is served. And yes, I overcooked half of these. Hope someone likes burnt edges." Chloe sprang up like she'd won a prize. "Burnt edges are the best," Marcus agreed, already halfway to the table. Simone accepted a plate David offered, arching a brow. "You skip another meal. He said I'm calling community services." She gave him a dry look. "I'd like to see them try to take me." He laughed, sitting beside her, their arms just brushing. Not flirtation, just warmth, familiar. The quiet closeness of two people who'd begun leaning without realizing they had. As they ate, Maya slid a folded paper toward Simone. "Finished," she said, proud. Expecting a unicorn or castle, Simone unfolded it lazily, but when she saw the drawing, her breath caught. A house, square simple with puffs of smoke curling from the chimney and snow on the roof. In front stood 6 stick figures, hand in hand. 3 tall, 3 small. Beneath them, names: David, Simone, Marcus, Maya, Chloe. One figure slightly taller than the rest was circled in red crayon. "Mama!" Simone's hands trembled. She looked at Maya, voice low. "You drew all of us." Maya nodded. "I made us a family. Like before, but better now." David leaned over to see it. His expression shifted, eyes, soft jaw tightening in that way men do when holding emotion. "That's a masterpiece," he said quietly. Chloe crawled into Simone's lap, pressing her face to her chest. "Do you like it, Mama?" That word Mama hit like a storm in a balm. Thomas had turned that name into a weapon, had made her feel she didn't deserve it unless she wore pearls and baked on Sundays. But here now, in this messy living room, her daughter said it with hope. Simone kissed Chloe's forehead. "I love it." The rest of the afternoon melted in laughter and play. Board games. A game of floor is lava that nearly destroyed 2 couch cushions. A hallway pillow fight where David abandoned all parental dignity and declared himself commander of chaos. Even Simone joined laughing as she tried to dodge a stuffed animal missile hair falling loose from her braid. That night, when the house settled again and the kids finally collapsed into their blanket nests, Simone sat quietly by the fireplace. On her lap, Maya's drawing. She traced the crayon lines again and again, memorizing them, not just the shapes, but the care in every line. The names. The circle. David entered with 2 mugs of cocoa and sat beside her on the hearth. Firelight danced across their faces, flickering gently against the stone. Marcus did something like that once, he said. A few weeks after Lena died. Drew a picture of our family with her still in it. I kept it. It's still folded in my wallet. Simone turned to him. "How did you get through it?" David exhaled. "I didn't. Not really. I just kept doing the next thing. Pancakes, homework, laundry. Repeat." Eventually the pain stopped screaming and started whispering. He looked at her, his voice steady. Losing someone isn't a single moment. It's 1,000 little surrenders. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone walks in and helps you carry the pieces. Simone flipped the drawing over and showed him the back. In crooked, hopeful letters, Maya had written, "Don't go away again, Mama." David didn't respond. He just reached out and rested his hand lightly over hers. No force, just presence. "I thought I was done," Simone whispered. "After Thomas, after the army. I thought there was nothing left to give." David's grip firmed just enough to steady her. "You're not done," he said. "You're just beginning." Her eyes stung. She blinked rapidly. "I'm scared. So am I." They sat in the hush that comes after truth. Not silence for the sake of silence, but the kind that settles over people who've stopped hiding. The fire crackled beside them. Upstairs, the children slept tangled in dreams and stuffed animals. And in a small house tucked beneath Georgia pines, a woman who had once been a captain, a wife, a warrior, and a ghost was slowly, quietly becoming someone new. Not a perfect version, not a fixed one, but a woman again, a mother again, herself again. By the time the warning hit the local radio station, the wind had already begun its slow, whispering crawl through the pine trees. Georgia was known for its sudden spring storms, but this one moved differently, like a secret too sharp to whisper. The air tasted metallic. The sky hung low, bruised gray, the kind that never meant drizzle but damage. David stood on the porch, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. The clouds crawled like muscle under skin. He tapped his thumb against the cup, mentally taking inventory: firewood, generator, bottled water. Habit. Preparation didn't kill panic, but it helped keep it quiet. Behind him, the door creaked. "You feel it too?" Simone asked. He turned. She stood zipped in her jacket, hair tucked into a knit cap, eyes narrowed into the wind. She didn't just look ready. She looked like a woman familiar with threat. Not from radar, but memory. "Barometer's dropping fast," David said. "Could be ugly." "I've seen worse," she replied, voice calm. "In combat or in Kansas." Simone smirked faintly. "Both, but mostly Iran. Year 3 of the Israel conflict. Sandstorms didn't knock on the door, they kicked it in." David raised an eyebrow. "That was your tour." "One of them," she said. "Convoy security and forward logistics. We once outran a firestorm that took out an entire checkpoint. Since then, I've trusted my gut over the weather app." David chuckled, but the humor didn't linger. The wind picked up. "We should check on Miss Eleanor Vance next door. She's still got that oxygen rig, and I haven't seen her grandson since Christmas." "I'll go," Simone said, instantly alert. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've got boots, legs, and instincts. I need to move." David didn't argue. "I'll keep the kettle warm." Simone moved fast. She always had. Within minutes, she was across the field, bundled in Marcus's old parka, carrying a thermos of hot tea and a flashlight in her coat pocket. The air snapped cold around her. Every gust against her face felt like pressure against her ribs, but it didn't stop her. In another life, it might have been the start of an extraction. The sky split with a low, gut-deep groan. Then the sleet came. David stood by the window, coffee forgotten, watching her form disappear into the haze of ice and wind. An hour passed. The storm hit like a wall. No transition, no warning, just impact. Trees bent. Ice cut sideways through the air. The lights flickered. The kids huddled beneath a mountain of quilts on the couch, whispering stories and passing the flashlight like a sacred flame. David had just laced one boot when the front door banged open. Simone stumbled inside, soaked to the bone, dragging a shivering bundle in her arms, blankets at first glance. But not just that. It was Miss Vance. "She lost power," Simone said between breaths. "Heater failed. I found her under 3 quilts, flashlight clenched in her teeth, while she tried to fix a fuse with a knitting needle." David helped her lower the elderly woman onto the couch. Simone peeled off her jacket, her boots squelching with water. Her braid was dripping, her face flushed from cold and adrenaline. "I carried her the last 100 yards," she said, almost to herself. She was light, mostly determination. Miss Vance looked up with wide eyes. "That woman's a damn general." David grinned. "Close." The kids sprang into action. Marcus brought extra pillows. Chloe offered juice. Maya tucked a blanket around Miss Vance's legs like a nurse in training. Simone stood slightly apart, catching her breath, her hands on her knees. David walked over and handed her a towel. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. It felt good. Doing something that mattered. David looked at her hair, plastered to her cheeks, sleeves rolled up red in the face from cold and effort. She didn't just look capable, she looked alive. "You know," he said, "I think you scared the storm more than it scared you." She laughed, then winced. "Maybe. Or maybe I just remembered who I used to be." That night, the lights returned with a sigh and a hum. Miss Vance slept soundly in Marcus's room, hugged by pillows and warmth. The kids had collapsed in the living room, a fortress of cushions and soft, tangled snores. David found Simone at the kitchen table, her boots drying near the heater. She was towel drying her hair, a fresh hoodie slung over one shoulder. He placed 2 mugs down. "Cocoa again. Ritual. Local news dropped your name," he said, showing her the screen. "Former Army captain rescues disabled neighbor in freak power outage." She groaned. "You called that in?" "Nope." "Pretty sure Miss Vance has political ambitions for you." Simone rolled her eyes, smiling tiredly. "I'm no hero, David." He sipped. "No, you're not, but you're exactly what this town didn't know it needed." She stared into her mug shoulders, slumping slightly, not in defeat, but release. "I miss that feeling," she said quietly. "The feeling of doing something that wasn't just about surviving." David nodded. "Then maybe it's time to stop just surviving." She looked at him. Really looked. Her eyes finally had light in them, not just from the lamp, but from within. something breaking open. "I haven't felt like myself in years," she said, barely more than a whisper. "You don't have to go back," David said. "You can build someone new." She reached across the table and laid her fingers lightly over the back of his hand. "Then maybe I'll start here." And in that warm kitchen, after a day of chaos and rescue and wet socks and silent strength, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with fireworks, but quietly, as all real things do. The storm had passed. What remained, what always remains if you let it, was the choice to rebuild. Together. By morning, the snow had melted into puddles along the edge of the porch. The pine needles glistened. Dogwood blossoms pushed gently through the thawing earth, small and bright, first messengers of spring. Simone stood on the porch, arms crossed, coffee in hand. She watched the girls chasing Marcus around the yard, their laughter rising and falling like waves in the breeze. She hadn't heard that kind of sound in years, not since Iran, not since the pop of gunfire had replaced children's songs and convoy engines had been louder than breath. Back then, joy felt like a casualty of war, like something she wasn't meant to hear again. But here it was unrehearsed, unguarded. She closed her eyes just for a second, breathed in pine, damp earth, firewood, cocoa, opened her heart a sliver wider. Maybe she wasn't a soldier anymore. Maybe she was something else now. Not weaker, just different, still strong, still standing, and finally beginning. David stepped beside her, holding his own mug. "Looks like the world didn't end," he said. She smirked. "Not yet." He nodded toward the small patch of turned earth where the children had been working. "Those girls of yours have a gift. I haven't seen anything grow out there since Lena." Simone followed his gaze. The girls had turned the rocky garden into something close, a beautiful crooked rows of sprouts pebbles, arranged in shapes even a tiny scarecrow built from popsicle sticks and yarn. They needed something to take care of, she said, something that would stay rooted. David sipped his coffee quiet. "Thank you," she added softly. "For what?" "For not letting me run. For making room." He looked at her, then really looked. It wasn't charity, it was recognition. She tilted her head. Of what? Of someone who still had something left to give. She didn't reply, but her eyes said it all. A week later, Simone walked into the town's community center and left with a volunteer badge and a key to the old supply closet. It was dusty, forgotten, but it had space light and potential. She spent the next 2 days sweeping, organizing, dragging folding chairs into a circle. When David stopped by with sandwiches, he found her on a ladder hanging a hand-painted sign that read, "Veterans Resilience Circle, Thursdays at 7 o'clock in the evening. No ranks, no judgments, just unwavering support." "You really don't do anything halfway, do you?" he said, passing her a sandwich. Simone shrugged, taking a bite. "People like me, we don't need therapy buzzwords. We need chairs of space, coffee strong enough to dissolve trauma." "Sounds like you found your mission." She hopped off the ladder, brushed off her hands. "I didn't come here looking for one, but maybe I was never supposed to stop serving. Just had to change the battlefield." He reached over and smoothed a bit of paint from her cheek. "Looks good on you. This purpose." She held his gaze a second longer than necessary. "Thanks," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "You should come by sometime. You don't have to be military to have ghosts." David chuckled. "I'll bring the coffee." Back at the house, spring cleaning had become a family affair. Marcus organized books by color. Chloe sorted mismatched socks like it was a mission from NASA. Maya declared war on dust bunnies. And David built something. It started as a spare tool shed, but by the weekend it had walls, insulation shelves, even a small wood-burning stove. "What is it?" Simone asked one afternoon, hands on her hips, squinting at the pine wood walls. David wiped sweat from his brow. "A space. For you, for the kids, for us." She raised an eyebrow. "Us?" He hesitated. "Look, I'm not proposing yet, but I figured maybe we stop pretending. You're temporary." Simone leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "And if I say I'm not ready for us yet?" David nodded, unbothered. "Then it's a really nice reading room." She laughed an honest, unguarded laugh that reached all the way to her eyes. Later that night, she found a piece of paper tacked to the wall of the new room. In David's strong handwriting, it read, "The Hearth Room, open for quiet contemplation, boisterous laughter, forgotten stories, new beginnings." She folded the paper and held it to her chest for a moment before slipping it into her journal. In May, Simone stood in front of the town library, wearing a soft blue blouse and jeans, holding the hands of her two daughters, while David and Marcus waited nearby. The library was hosting a Community Pillars Night. She'd been nominated without her knowledge. Miss Eleanor Vance had sent in the story. Simone tried to escape before her name was called, but Maya tugged her hand and whispered, "Please go, Mama." They need to see what strong looks like. So Simone stepped up. She didn't talk about war. She didn't talk about loss. She talked about rebuilding. About a man who told her, "You're coming with me," and didn't mean rescue. He meant belonging. About children who taught her to laugh again. About Georgia soil and paper drawings taped to bedroom walls. She finished with one sentence, "I arrived here believing I needed to survive. I stayed because I learned how to truly live." The crowd stood, David stood, and when she stepped down, she walked straight into his arms, not hiding, not hesitating, just home. The morning of the wedding dawned cool and quiet. The Georgia sky brushed in soft pastels like someone had dipped their fingers in spring and painted it gently across the horizon. Simone stood barefoot on the wooden porch, still in her robe, coffee in hand. She stared at the field where wildflowers had begun to bloom, tiny bursts of yellow lavender and white swaying in the breeze like nature's own confetti. Behind her, the house buzzed with hushed chaos. Chloe and Maya were already in their dresses, arguing over who would drop petals and who would hold the rings. Marcus had taken his role as best man in charge of snacks far too seriously and was currently restocking the lemonade table with military precision. David, true to form, was calm, steady, the eye in the storm of tulle and frosting. Simone didn't know how he managed to look so composed, with a tie slung loose around his neck and a boutonniere made of pine and thistle pinned slightly crooked to his chest. But he did. Of course he did. She smiled, sipping her coffee, letting the warmth sink deep. She never thought this day would come. Not because she didn't believe in love, but because she had stopped believing it was something she deserved. She heard the screen door creak and turned to see Miss Eleanor Vance shuffle out her oxygen tank, humming softly, dressed in her Sunday best and wearing a pair of sunglasses shaped like hearts. "Well," she said, "I lived through 2 husbands, a tornado, and disco, but I'll say this today is something special." Simone chuckled. "High praise." "I just came to tell you," the older woman added, "don't look too serious up there. Smile like you mean it. You've earned this." Simone nodded slowly. "Thank you." Miss Vance reached out, squeezed her hand. "And honey, don't ever let anyone tell you this wasn't a victory. You're walking down that aisle like a general coming home." Simone blinked away sudden tears and kissed the woman's cheek. Inside, she dressed alone. No big mirror, no ivory gown with a train long enough to trip over. Just a simple fitted dress, the color of wild cream, a denim jacket over her shoulders, and her army captain's bars discreetly fastened at the collar. Her daughters entered the room just before the music started. Chloe gasped, "You look like a queen." Simone knelt down. "No, sweethearts, I just look like myself." She took their hands. And that's finally enough. The ceremony was held beneath the same venerable oak tree where David had once carved a heart for Lena years ago. He'd sanded the bark smooth and carved a new one beside it. Now D+S nested in the same space, not replacing, just growing. The guests were few close neighbors, some folks from town, 3 veterans from Simone's support group who'd driven in from hours away just to see her smile in person. Maya and Chloe scattered petals like seasoned professionals. Marcus stood proud, holding a pillow with 2 wooden rings David had carved himself, simple, imperfect, and full of meaning. Simone walked down that makeshift aisle with slow, certain steps, not afraid, not uncertain, but grounded whole. Each footstep carried a memory, a weight, a choice. She wasn't starting over. She was continuing, and she was choosing it freely. David met her with a steady gaze and took her hands without hesitation. "I don't have vows written down," he said, voice quiet but firm, "because everything I want to promise you I've already started doing." She smiled, eyes shimmering. "Then keep doing it," she said, "and I will too." The efficient pastor Anya Sharma from the town's tiny church declared them husband and wife with a warmth that wrapped around everyone like a wool blanket. They kissed under the oak tree with petals swirling and children cheering and the sky stretching wide with possibility. The reception was nothing fancy. Just a few folding tables, mismatched chairs, paper lanterns, and a potluck that could feed a battalion. Simone danced with her daughters, laughing so hard her ribs ached. David taught Marcus how to twirl a girl without stepping on her toes. The music was loud, the food was messy, and everything about it was beautifully unpolished. At one point, someone turned off the music, and Simone was handed a microphone. She tried to refuse. Then she looked around at the faces that had welcomed her, held space for her, believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. She cleared her throat. "I was a soldier," she began. "I led platoons. I planned operations. I gave orders and followed them. And when it was over, I thought I'd used up all the parts of myself that mattered." She paused, but I was wrong. She looked toward David, then down at her girls dancing in bare feet, faces lit with joy. Because sometimes the most courageous thing you can do isn't surviving. It's loving again, trusting again, building again. Today isn't a beginning. It's a continuation, a life rebuilt with kindness, one day at a time. The crowd erupted into applause, not polite, but full-hearted. Simone set the mic down and walked straight into David's arms, and as the sun dipped below the hills, casting gold across their backyard, two hearts, once broken, once battle-worn, beat in rhythm again, side by side at peace. Years passed, not in a blur, but in the slow, deliberate unfolding of ordinary days, each one stitched together by laughter repair and something that felt a lot like grace. Georgia summers came and went golden and buzzing with life. Winters settled in quietly with snow-draped rooftops and cocoa-stained mugs. The house that once stood like a shelter had become a home. Not just a roof and four walls, but a place where people belonged. Simone stood at the kitchen sink, drying a plate, while Maya and Chloe chased Marcus through the backyard. The twins had shot up like weeds, taller now, sharper in wit, but still quick to hold hands. Marcus had taken to calling them his Chaos Squad, and they wore the title proudly. The radio hummed softly in the background, some old gospel or blues tune David insisted on keeping in the rotation. The dog barked at nothing. The wind rustled the pine trees, and somewhere in that quiet symphony of domestic noise, Simone exhaled, without realizing she'd been holding her breath. "Hey, sweetheart," David called from the back door, a clipboard in one hand and a pencil tucked behind his ear. "They want you to speak again at the State Veterans Empowerment Summit this fall. She turned, arching a brow. "Why do I feel like you already said yes for me?" "I might have said you'd consider it," he grinned, leaning against the doorframe. "They want to honor you for the work you've done with the support group, the community outreach, and the fact that you're basically the town's unofficial crisis response team." Simone shook her head, amused. "I'm a glorified coffee supplier with a loud voice." "You're a beacon," David said simply. She looked at him. Really looked. His hair had grown a little grayer around the temples. He still wore flannel-like armor, still carved things in the shed out back when words felt too small. But more than anything, he still saw her exactly as she was. No medals, no pretense, just Simone. "I'll think about it," she said, turning back to the sink. He stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and kissed the side of her neck. "That's all I ever ask." That evening, Marcus wandered into the living room carrying a small photo album, the spine worn and corners frayed. He flopped onto the couch and flipped through the pages until Simone sat beside him. "Remember this?" he asked, pointing to a snapshot of them all on the porch, muddy, chaotic, smiling. "Of course," Simone said. "That was the day we tried to build a treehouse and ended up with a glorified ladder." Marcus laughed. "You were wearing army boots and a tutu." She smirked. "That was a dare. From Chloe." They flipped through more photos, some candid, some blurry, some filled with a kind of joy too big for frames. Marcus paused on one in particular. It was the drawing Maya had made years ago, the one with the 6 stick figures, and the word Mama circled in red. "She still keeps that on her wall," Marcus said quietly. Simone traced the faded crayon with her finger. "So do I." He looked up at her, his eyes wiser than his years. "You know you changed everything when you stayed?" Simone blinked, caught off guard. "Not just for the girls," Marcus continued. "For Papa. For me. For this house. You brought something back. I don't know what to call it, but it's here now." Simone pulled him into a hug, holding him close. "I didn't come here to change anything." "But you did anyway," he whispered. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and the fire had burned low, Simone stepped out onto the porch. The stars above were endless, clear, familiar. She pulled her jacket tighter and walked barefoot through the damp grass to the little garden by the shed. Dogwood blossoms still bloomed there, stubborn and soft. A small wooden bench sat beneath the oak tree, the same one where she and David had exchanged vows. She sat down, staring up at the sky, and let the quiet settle over her like a second skin. The stillness held her gently. The night didn't demand anything of her. It simply let her be. So much had changed, and yet so much hadn't. She was still Simone, still flawed, still learning how to be soft without breaking, still a little scared, but no longer running. Behind her, David joined her without a word. He sat shoulder to shoulder, their silence full of shared years. "You ever wonder?" she said softly. "What would have happened if you hadn't stopped at that diner?" He chuckled. "Every day. What do you think we'd be doing now?" "Probably surviving, but not living. Not like this." He nodded. "I think I'd still be making bad coffee, and you'd still be saving people, but we'd both be lonelier, less whole." She nodded. "Funny, isn't it, how 4 words can change everything?" He smiled. "You're coming with me." Simone leaned her head against his shoulder. No regrets? Not one. And in that quiet Georgia night, beneath a sky wide enough to hold every version of who they had been, and every possibility of who they still could become, Simone closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to remember, to feel, to be alive, to be home, to be loved, and finally, without fear, to stay. A few months later, the Georgia summer stretched long and thick, the kind that made the air shimmer and the evenings feel like golden syrup poured slow over the hills. Simone stood in front of the community center, wiping her hands on her jeans, the sun warm on her shoulders. Behind her, the last of the folding chairs were being stacked, the coffee urn unplugged, and clean the sign on the door flipped to closed. The veterans' circle had wrapped for the day. It had been a hard session. One of the older members, Tony, had finally opened up about losing his brother in Afghanistan, and the room had held his silence like a sacred thing. Simone hadn't said much during the meeting, but she'd sat beside him, one hand resting on the table, near his close enough to anchor, but not smother. When he'd stood up at the end, shoulders shaking just slightly, she didn't congratulate or comfort him. She just nodded. That nod meant everything. Sometimes you don't need to be strong. You just need to be heard. David pulled up in the truck just as she locked the door. He leaned out the window, one arm slung casually over the edge. "You want to come with me to the hardware store?" he asked. "I need a second opinion on paint. Marcus thinks the tool shed should be purple." Simone chuckled, walking over and sliding into the passenger seat. "Purple's bold. I respect the commitment." David grinned. "That's not a yes." She glanced at him, eyebrow raised. "It's not a no." They drove in easy silence, the kind that grows between people who don't need to fill space to feel close. The radio played something soft, maybe Sam Cooke or Otis Redding, and the road unwound ahead of them, familiar and full of memory. At the hardware store, Marcus greeted them with a dramatic sigh. "She's been in there for 20 minutes, he whispered, pointing toward the paint aisle. Inside, Maya stood at the far end, arms crossed, Chloe beside her, holding a color swatch like a precious artifact. Simone and David approached quietly, not wanting to disturb the sacred art of decision-making. "You two starting an interior design business?" David asked. Chloe looked up with mock seriousness. "We're choosing the new color for the hearth room. It's important." Maya nodded. "It has to feel like safety, but also like adventure. And maybe ice cream." Simone crouched beside them, studying the samples. "This one's called Honey Pine. Kinda warm, kinda happy." Maya's eyes lit up. "Yes, that one." Chloe nodded firmly. "And we'll paint it ourselves." That weekend, the entire family gathered at the hearth room. Brushes were dipped, walls transformed. Marcus took charge of taping the baseboards, muttering about precision like an old pro. David set up music on a small speaker, something upbeat and soulful. At one point, Chloe painted a perfect yellow sun on the inside of the door, signing her name beneath it in shaky, confident letters. Simone stood back, hands on her hips, and felt a swell of something she couldn't quite name. Not pride, not joy alone, something deeper. The feeling of roots finally taking hold in soil that had once felt foreign. That night, after the girls were asleep, Simone and David sat on the porch, the moon high, the cicadas buzzing in the distance. "I talked to the county office," Simone said, her voice low. "They're expanding the community support program. Asked if I'd take a leadership role." David looked over surprised. "That's big." She nodded. "I said yes." He leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'm proud of you." Simone glanced at him. You ever think about everything that had to happen to get us here? David didn't answer right away. He looked out at the yard where dogwood trees swayed gently in the wind. All the time he said, "But I try not to question it too much. Life doesn't always give you answers, just moments, and you gotta choose what to do with them." The next morning, a letter arrived in the mail addressed to Simone Dubois. The return label read, Department of Veterans Affairs. She stared at it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a formal notice her appeal for reevaluation had been approved. Her service-connected PTSD would now be recognized at a higher disability rating. She would receive back pay, additional support, and most importantly, an official acknowledgement of her pain. She sat down at the kitchen table, the paper shaking in her hands. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about being seen. Finally. Officially. Without having to beg. David found her there a few minutes later. She didn't say anything at first, just handed him the letter. He read it slowly, then looked up. "About damn time," he said. She exhaled a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. "I didn't think they'd ever listen." He knelt beside her, one hand on her knee. "They didn't have a choice. You made them." She nodded. Then after a long moment she whispered, "I think I'm ready." David frowned slightly. "For what?" She looked at him. "To forgive. Myself. The system. Maybe even Thomas. Not because they deserve it, but because I deserve peace." Later that week, she took Maya and Chloe to the cemetery on the edge of town. They brought wildflowers and a small wooden cross the girls had painted themselves. It was for Thomas. Simone didn't say much, just knelt by the plot, whispered a few words only the wind could hear, then stood. The girls held her hands on either side. He was brave, she told them. But sometimes brave people get lost, and when they do, the ones left behind have to carry both the pain and the love. It's not fair, but it's what we do. Chloe hugged her waist. Maya said nothing, just squeezed her hand. The next few months passed in a rhythm that was soft but strong. School mornings, community meetings, Thursday night, circles Saturday, pancake rituals. One afternoon, a new face showed up at the veterans group, a woman named Teresa, recently discharged, guarded, and sharp. Simone welcomed her with a simple nod. Later after the meeting, Teresa lingered. "How do you do it?" she asked. "Live like this." After everything, Simone thought for a long moment before answering. "I stopped trying to go back. I started building forward, one chair, one story, one breath at a time." That evening, as David tucked Marcus in, the boy asked quietly, "Do you think we'll always stay like this?" David paused, like what Marcus looked up. Together. Safe. Happy. David brushed a hand through his son's hair. "I don't know what always means, but I know this: every day we get, we build, and the more we build, the stronger it gets." Simone stood outside the window listening. Her hand pressed lightly to the glass as if anchoring the moment. She closed her eyes, breathing it in, the ordinary magic of a life rebuilt not by luck, but by choice, by care, by stubborn hope. When she turned away, she did so not with fear, but with certainty. She was here. She was home. She was whole. And she was just getting started. Thank you for staying with us through this entire journey. If you've made it to the end, it means something in this story spoke to your heart, and for that, I'm deeply grateful. Simone, David, Marcus, Maya, and Chloe aren't just characters. They represent resilience. They remind us that kindness changes lives, that even in the quiet corners of the world, be it a porch in small-town Georgia or your own neighborhood, acts of compassion can rebuild broken souls. This was more than a story about a single dad, a soldier, and twin girls. It was about choosing love over fear, community over isolation, and realizing that sometimes all it takes is 4 words. You're coming with me to change everything. Wherever you're watching from around the world, I'd love to know what part of this story moved you most. Did it remind you of someone you love? A moment when a stranger saved your life in a way you never forgot. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. This is a space for real stories, real hearts, and connection. If this veteran recovery journey touched something inside you, if you felt the weight of family healing or the lift of an emotional homecoming, consider giving this story a like. Subscribe if you'd like to be here for more heartwarming stories, uplifting human truths and narratives that remind us we are never alone in our struggles or in our healing. Thank you for being part of this. For every small act of support you're helping, build a community where hope and humanity still matter. See you in the next story. Until then, take care of yourself and each other.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.